Berlin, June 2012. Inside a quiet internet cafe, a young man sat calmly in front of a computer screen. Nothing about him appeared unusual. No panic, no visible fear, no sign that law enforcement agencies across multiple countries were actively searching for him. He looked relaxed, almost comfortable.
Peter, it was right at this very spot that Luka Magnotta was surfing the internet when he was spotted, questioned, and then arrested, ending a feverish manhunt that has made headlines around the world.
As if he had nowhere else to be. But what made this moment extraordinary was not where he was. It was who he was. Because sitting inside the cafe was one of the most wanted men in the world. A man whose name had become synonymous with obsession, manipulation, violence, and one of the most disturbing global manhunts the internet had ever witnessed. His name was Luka Magnotta, and by the time police were closing in, millions of people already knew his face. Not because he was famous in the traditional sense. Not because he had built something extraordinary. Not because he had earned admiration. No, people knew him because of something far more disturbing. He wanted to be seen, desperately. For years, he had chased attention with relentless hunger. Fame was not simply something he desired. It had become something he needed. And that hunger would slowly evolve into something darker, something more dangerous. What began as a craving for recognition would eventually trigger a chain of events so shocking that strangers across the internet would unite to hunt him down. Not police, not detectives, ordinary people. People sitting behind screens, forum users, amateur investigators, internet strangers, who began noticing patterns long before the world fully understood what they were seeing. And as they followed those patterns, they realized something chilling. This was not random behavior. This was escalation, a progression, step by step, post by post, warning by warning. The signs had been there, hidden in plain sight. But by the time the world paid attention, it was already too late. Because somewhere between obsession and performance, between fantasy and reality, a line had been crossed. And once that happened, the chase became global. Airports were alerted. International warrants were issued. Authorities raced against time, and one terrifying question began haunting everyone involved. Where would he go next? But perhaps an even more disturbing question lingered beneath the surface. What if running was never the real goal? What if being chased, being hunted, being watched by the entire world was exactly what he wanted? Because this is not just the story of a killer. It is the story of obsession, of identity, of performance, of a man who spent years trying to become famous, no matter the cost. And by the end, the world knew his name. The question is, was that the plan all along? Long before the headlines, before the global manhunt, before the world associated his name with fear, there was simply a boy trying to be seen. Luka Magnotta was born Eric Clinton Newman in Canada, and like many people whose lives later become the subject of public scrutiny, his early years were far more complicated than they first appeared. Accounts from people who knew him often described someone deeply concerned with image. Appearance mattered. Attention mattered. Validation mattered. Even at a young age, there seemed to be a strong desire to be noticed, to be admired, to be desired. But wanting attention is not unusual. Millions of people crave recognition. What made Luka different was the intensity. It wasn't enough to simply exist in the background. Ordinary life did not seem satisfying. Being unseen felt unbearable. And over time, that desire began transforming into something more consuming. Reinvention. He changed names. He changed appearances. He carefully shaped how others perceived him. Not just physically, but socially, psychologically, almost as if he were constantly constructing a new version of himself. A better version, a more desirable version, a more famous version. And perhaps that is where one of the most important patterns in this story begins. Luka did not just want attention. He wanted control over attention. He wanted to decide what people saw, what they believed, what they admired. Image became power, and power became identity. As he grew older, this obsession became increasingly visible. Photo shoots, modeling aspirations, cosmetic enhancements, online profiles, glamorous self-promotion. He pursued fame through every avenue available to him. Reality television, adult entertainment, online media, social platforms, anything that offered visibility, anything that offered recognition. But fame remained frustratingly out of reach. Close enough to chase, yet always just beyond his grasp. And that can be psychologically dangerous, because prolonged rejection can distort ambition. The dream remains alive, but frustration grows. The hunger intensifies. The need becomes desperate. For some people, failure becomes motivation. For others, it becomes an obsession. And obsession rarely stays still. It evolves. It adapts. It searches for new ways to be satisfied. By the late 2000s, one truth about Luka was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. He was not just trying to become famous. He was studying fame, studying what attracted attention, studying what made people talk, what triggered curiosity, what created headlines, and perhaps most disturbing of all, he appeared to understand something many people overlook. Attention does not care whether it is positive or negative. Admiration creates visibility. Controversy creates visibility. Fear creates visibility. Shock creates visibility. In the end, visibility is visibility. And once someone begins believing that any attention is better than no attention, boundaries can begin to disappear. Because what began as vanity would slowly evolve into something much darker. The pursuit of attention was no longer just about being admired. Soon, it would become about provoking reaction, and reaction would become everything. At first, the attention Luka received was limited. A few comments, a few messages, occasional recognition, small bursts of validation. For most people, that would have been enough. But for Luka, attention had already stopped feeling like a reward. It had become a necessity, something he needed to feel real, something he needed to feel significant. And that distinction matters, because once validation becomes psychological survival, people begin making dangerous compromises. They stop asking what is healthy. They start asking what works. What gets clicks? What gets reactions? What gets people talking? And by the late 2000s, the internet had become the perfect environment for someone like Luka. Because the internet rewards extremes, not moderation, not silence. Extremes. The louder the signal, the more attention it attracts. The more shocking the content, the more people engage. And Luka appeared to understand that very well. He became increasingly active online, posting photos, building personas, participating in forums, creating narratives around himself, sometimes glamorous, sometimes mysterious, sometimes controversial. But beneath all of it, a pattern began emerging. He wasn't satisfied with ordinary visibility anymore. He wanted fascination. He wanted obsession. He wanted people talking about him even when he wasn't in the room. And soon, something unusual began happening. Rumors started appearing online. Strange claims, anonymous posts, stories linking Luka to wealthy older men, stories suggesting secret benefactors, stories implying hidden influence. At first, these looked like internet gossip, the kind of bizarre speculation forums produce every day. But some online observers noticed something odd. Many of the rumors seemed strangely convenient, almost theatrical, almost designed to generate intrigue. That observation led to a disturbing theory. What if Luka himself were helping create the rumors? What if he wasn't merely responding to attention, but actively manufacturing it? If true, that changes everything, because it suggests something critical about his psychology. Attention was no longer something he waited for. It became something he engineered, something he cultivated, something he manipulated. Reality became flexible. Perception became more important than truth. And once perception matters more than truth, deception becomes easier. Reinvention becomes easier. Performance becomes easier. That is when obsession starts becoming dangerous, because performance demands escalation. What shocked people yesterday becomes ordinary tomorrow. What earned attention last week stops working next week. And when attention fades, the pressure returns, the hunger returns, the silence returns. For someone addicted to visibility, silence can feel unbearable. And that is what makes this stage of Luka's story so unsettling. The warning signs were there, not obvious to everyone, but visible enough for those paying close attention. Patterns of manipulation, patterns of performance, patterns of increasingly calculated behavior. The internet was no longer just a platform for Luka. It had become his stage, and he was becoming willing to do more, say more, risk more, to keep the audience watching. Because by now, one thing was becoming terrifyingly clear. Luka did not just want fame. He wanted control over the emotional reaction of strangers. He wanted shock. He wanted obsession. He wanted power. And soon, people online would begin seeing content so disturbing. They would realize this was no longer about attention seeking. Something far more alarming was beginning to emerge. People noticed something was wrong, but nobody understood how far it would go. By now, something had changed. The attention Luka once chased, through glamour and self-promotion, was no longer enough. Visibility alone had stopped satisfying him. He needed stronger reactions, stronger emotions, stronger shock. And that is often how escalation begins. Quietly, gradually, one boundary at a time. What appears harmless at first can evolve into something deeply disturbing when attention becomes the primary reward. And for people paying close attention to Luka's online behavior, the shift became impossible to ignore. The content surrounding him was changing. The tone was changing. Even the emotional energy felt different. What once looked like vanity now carried something colder, something more deliberate, something designed to provoke discomfort. Soon, disturbing material began circulating online. Content that triggered alarm among internet communities. People who saw it felt immediate unease, not simply because the material was shocking, but because of what it appeared to communicate. Control, performance, detachment. That combination frightened people. Because disturbing behavior alone is one thing. What if Luka himself were helping create the rumors? What if he wasn't merely responding to attention, but actively manufacturing it? Because it suggests something critical about his psychology. Attention was no longer something he waited for. It became something he engineered, something he cultivated, something he manipulated. Reality became flexible. Perception became more important than truth. And once perception matters more than truth, deception becomes easier. Reinvention becomes easier. Performance becomes easier. That is when obsession starts becoming dangerous. Because performance demands escalation. What shocked people yesterday becomes ordinary tomorrow. What earned attention last week stops working next week. And when attention fades, the pressure returns, the hunger returns, the silence returns. For someone addicted to visibility, silence can feel unbearable. And that is what makes this stage of Luka's story so unsettling. The warning signs were there, not obvious to everyone, but visible enough for those paying close attention. Patterns of manipulation, patterns of performance, patterns of increasingly calculated behavior. The internet was no longer just a platform for Luka. It had become his stage, and he was becoming willing to do more, say more, risk more, to keep the audience watching. Because by now, one thing was becoming terrifyingly clear. Luka did not just want fame. He wanted control over the emotional reaction of strangers. He wanted shock. He wanted obsession. He wanted power. And soon, people online would begin seeing content so disturbing. They would realize this was no longer about attention seeking. Something far more alarming was beginning to emerge. People noticed something was wrong, but nobody understood how far it would go. By now, something had changed. Online communities began discussing him more intensely. Forum threads multiplied. Anonymous users compared screenshots, archived content, usernames, posting patterns. People began asking difficult questions. Was this really Luka? Was he responsible? Was he trying to send a message? Or was something else happening? At first, many dismissed the concerns. The internet is full of rumors. False accusations spread quickly. Speculation often outruns evidence. But this felt different. The same name kept resurfacing. The same face kept appearing. The same patterns kept returning. And then something even more unsettling happened. A small group of internet users stopped watching passively. They started investigating. Not professionals, not law enforcement, ordinary people. people from different countries who had never met. They began collecting evidence, saving posts, archiving content, tracking timestamps, comparing details. Piece by piece, they began constructing something that looked increasingly credible. A pattern, and patterns can be dangerous, because once random incidents begin forming recognizable structure, denial becomes harder. What terrified these investigators most was not just the content itself. It was the escalation. Each incident appeared more deliberate, more calculated, more extreme, as if someone were testing boundaries, watching reactions, learning what generated the strongest emotional response. That observation led to a chilling realization. What if the audience itself had become part of the performance? What if every reaction, every post, every discussion was feeding him exactly what he wanted? Because if attention was the reward, then even fear could become validation. And by this point, a horrifying question had emerged. Were people witnessing warning signs or watching a countdown? The internet had started noticing. The evidence was growing. The concern was spreading. But there was one devastating problem. No one truly knew how close danger had become. People noticed something was wrong, but nobody knew how far it would go. And then, the line between online behavior and real-world violence disappeared. Then came May 2012, the moment everything changed. Up until this point, much of the concern surrounding Luka existed in digital spaces. Screens, forums, archived posts, speculation, fear, suspicion. But what many had feared was about to become real, painfully real. What happened next would send shockwaves far beyond online communities. It would become international news, and it would confirm the worst fears of the people who had been tracking him for months. The escalation was no longer theoretical. It was no longer digital. It was real. Authorities began investigating a horrifying crime connected to Luka. The case immediately triggered widespread shock, not only because of the crime itself, but because of what it appeared to reveal. Intent, preparation, performance. That last word mattered. Performance. Because investigators began noticing something deeply disturbing about the case. This did not appear to be a crime driven purely by impulse. There were signs of planning, signs of staging. Signs suggest the act may have been designed to generate reaction. And that possibility changed everything. Because, if true, this was not only violence. It was violence intertwined with attention-seeking, a terrifying fusion of harm and performance. The crime sent media outlets into overdrive. News coverage spread rapidly. Television networks picked up the story. Online communities exploded with reaction.
Very fast-moving case here, as you say, which began, it seems so long ago now, on Tuesday morning with the delivery of that decomposing human foot to Canada's Conservative Party headquarters. And it's hard to keep up with what is fact and what isn't and what is reportable and so forth. As you mentioned at a recent news conference, they named the suspect as 29-year-old Luka Magnotta, and the countrywide warrant has been issued for him.
But turned into horror. Horror turned into disbelief. People struggled to process what they were seeing. For the amateur investigators who had spent months tracking Luka online, the realization was devastating. Their fears had been justified. The warning signs had been real. The patterns they noticed had not been coincidence. The escalation they feared had happened. And with that realization came something even heavier: guilt. Some began asking painful questions. Could this have been stopped? Could earlier intervention have changed the outcome? Did someone miss opportunities to act? Those questions would haunt many people involved. Because hindsight has a cruel clarity. After tragedy, warning signs often appear obvious. But in real time, certainty is rare. And while the world struggled to comprehend the crime, investigators focused on something urgent: finding Luka. Because by now, one terrifying reality had become clear. If he had already crossed this line, what was stopping further escalation? That question changed the investigation overnight. This was no longer about monitoring suspicious online behavior. This had become an international manhunt. Authorities moved quickly. Search efforts intensified. Borders became critical. Travel records mattered. Digital footprints mattered. Every hour mattered. Because somewhere out there, Luka was still moving, still thinking, still adapting, and the most frightening possibility remained unanswered. Was he trying to escape, or was he preparing for something else? Because if there was one thing investigators now understood, it was this: the person they were hunting did not think like most people. He craved something beyond safety, beyond freedom, beyond survival. He craved attention, and attention was now coming from the entire world. Long before many law enforcement agencies fully understood the scale of the threat, someone else had already started connecting the dots. Ordinary people, people with no badges, no forensic labs, no investigative authority, just computers, internet access, and an unwillingness to ignore what they had seen. This is what makes the Luka Magnotta case unlike almost any other modern criminal investigation. Before the global headlines, before the international manhunt reached its peak, small online communities were already tracking him, watching him, studying him, trying to understand what they were seeing. At first, they were just strangers connected by concern. Forum users, animal rights communities, Reddit-style discussion groups, Facebook users, anonymous message boards, people from different countries, different time zones, different backgrounds. Most had never met, yet they shared one instinct. Something about Luka felt deeply wrong, and once the crime became public, that instinct hardened into determination. They were no longer asking whether he was dangerous. They knew. Now they wanted answers. Where was he? How was he moving? What had he left behind? What clues had everyone missed? That was when the internet did something remarkable. It began behaving like a decentralized intelligence network. One person analyzed video backgrounds. Another examined timestamps. Someone else studied reflections. Others tracked travel clues, street signs, electrical outlets, furniture, brand labels, accent clues, metadata, tiny details most people would never notice. And that is what made their effort extraordinary. Individually, each clue meant very little. Together, they formed patterns. Patterns that narrowed possibilities. Patterns that reduced uncertainty. Patterns that brought strangers closer to a man they had never met. Closer than anyone expected. The investigation became relentless. Screenshots were archived before deletion. Profiles were monitored. Aliases were documented. Digital breadcrumbs were preserved. Every deleted post created more urgency, because deletion itself can be a clue. Silence can be a clue. Absence can be evidence. And as these internet investigators dug deeper, something chilling became clear. Luka had spent years carefully constructing versions of himself online. Multiple identities, multiple narratives, multiple masks. Each one designed to manipulate perception. Each one designed to control the story. But maintaining multiple identities creates vulnerability. Because the more masks someone wears, the harder it becomes to keep them all consistent. Eventually, contradictions appear, mistakes happen, patterns leak, and those patterns became visible to the people hunting him online. That realization gave them momentum. For the first time, the chase felt real, progress felt possible. And perhaps the most unsettling part of all, there was the growing suspicion that Luka might actually be watching them, reading the forums, following the discussions, studying the reactions. Because if attention was his fuel, then millions discussing his name online may have given him exactly what he always wanted: an audience, a global audience. Which raises a disturbing possibility. What if this chase wasn't just a pursuit? What if, in some twisted way, it had become a performance? Because as internet detectives closed in, so did law enforcement. And soon, the world's digital search would collide with a real-world manhunt. The walls were closing in, fast. By now, the chase had become global. This was no longer confined to online forums, archived screenshots, or anonymous message boards. Law enforcement agencies across multiple countries were now actively involved. The investigation had crossed borders, and with every passing hour, the pressure intensified. Because investigators were now facing a terrifying reality. Luka was mobile. He was moving, and movement creates uncertainty. Every airport became relevant. Every border crossing mattered. Every passport record became critical. Because once a suspect begins moving internationally, the window for capture can narrow with frightening speed. A single flight can change everything. A missed lead can cost days. A delay can mean disappearance. Authorities began reconstructing his movements, travel routes, digital activity, financial traces, immigration records. Every clue mattered. Every fragment mattered. Because somewhere inside that growing mountain of data was one question everyone needed answered. Where is Luka now? That question became increasingly difficult to answer. Reports suggested movement across Europe. Different cities, different sightings, different leads. Some are credible, some are false, some deliberate misdirection. And that made the hunt even more complicated. Because investigators were no longer just tracking movement. They were also battling uncertainty. Was Luka improvising or following a plan? That distinction mattered. A panicked fugitive makes mistakes. A calculated fugitive creates traps. And Luka had already shown a disturbing ability to manipulate perception. He understood attention. He understood spectacle. He understood narrative, which raised a troubling possibility. What if the chase itself had become part of the story he wanted to create? What if every news alert, every headline, every search notice was feeding the identity he had spent years trying to build? Because for someone obsessed with fame, notoriety can become its own form of success. and the world was now giving him something extraordinary. Total visibility. His face was everywhere. News broadcasts, online articles, television panels, international alerts. Millions of people who had never heard his name now knew exactly who he was. The attention had become global, but so had the hunt. Authorities tightened coordination. Intelligence was shared faster. Leads moved across jurisdictions. Pressure mounted. The walls were closing in. And then, a critical lead emerged. Berlin, a city filled with movement. Tourists, transit hubs, crowded streets. Perfect for blending in. Perfect for disappearing. Or so it seemed. Because by this point, the distance between hunter and hunted had become dangerously small. Luka had spent years controlling the narrative, controlling perception, controlling attention. But control has limits. Eventually, reality catches up. And in Berlin, that moment had finally arrived. The chase was almost over. He just didn't know it yet. After weeks of international pursuit, the chase that had consumed investigators, journalists, and internet communities was finally approaching its end. Berlin, the city where movement never stops, where thousands pass through cafes, train stations, and public spaces every hour. A city large enough for anonymity, large enough to disappear. Yet on that day, disappearing was no longer possible. Somewhere inside the city, Luka was still moving through ordinary spaces, walking among strangers, passing people who had no idea one of the world's most wanted fugitives was only steps away. And then, the break came. Authorities received the lead they needed.
It was a police van, he says. I stopped them and said, there is someone here who I'm sure you're looking for.
A quiet internet cafe, rows of computer screens, people immersed in their own worlds, and among them sat Luka Magnotta, looking at a screen, not running, not hiding, not panicking. That detail would later disturb many people, because after everything, after the global manhunt, after the media frenzy, after becoming the center of worldwide attention, he appeared strangely composed, almost detached, as if the moment unfolding around him was somehow expected. Officers moved in, carefully, quickly. The distance closed, seconds stretched. Then, contact. The chase was over.
Extremely happy, extremely pleased to confirm you that the number one suspect for our 11th homicide on the Montreal territory had been arrested. He was apprehended in Berlin in Germany, and he was apprehended this morning 8 o'clock for us, 2 o'clock p.m. for the local authorities. And the reason why it's been broadcast in the media is, and we never confirmed that, we're waiting to get a 100% result of that, and this is the fingerprints that confirm his identity. Interpol have confirmed that to us less than an hour ago. So, and this year's are
one of the most bizarre and unsettling international manhunts in recent memory had ended inside an ordinary cafe. No dramatic shootout, no desperate escape, no final confrontation. Just a quiet arrest. And perhaps that quiet ending made the story even more disturbing. Because after months of chaos, the final moment felt almost ordinary. But beneath that ordinary moment sat something profound.
So all kind of questions that we don't have the answer at this moment, but at least the good news now, at least the good info is that we got a suspect with us. He's in custody, and this is thanks for the help of the public, thanks for the help of different partners with Interpol also. We've been apprehended.
The illusion had collapsed. The identities, the personas, the performance, the masks, all of it had finally run out of space. For years, Luka had attempted to control how the world saw him, to shape perception, to direct attention, to remain at the center of the story. But now, control had shifted. The story no longer belonged to him, or so it seemed, because one question still lingered in the minds of investigators, journalists, and the millions who followed the case. Did Luka fear capture, or had he always known this moment would come? And more disturbingly, did some part of him want it? Because by the time he was arrested, the thing he had chased for years had finally become reality. The world knew his name. Everyone was watching. For many people, the story ends with the arrest. The manhunt ended. Authorities won. The fugitive was captured. Case closed. Simple, clean, resolved. But some cases refuse to end that neatly. Because once the headlines fade, once the news coverage disappears, once public attention moves elsewhere, the deeper questions remain. And the Luka Magnotta case leaves behind questions that feel deeply uncomfortable. Not just about crime, not just about violence, but about us, about the world we have built, about attention. Because this case forces us to confront something unsettling about modern life. Attention has become one of the most powerful currencies on Earth. People chase it, build careers from it, measure self-worth through it, fight for it. Obsession with visibility is no longer rare. It has become normal. Social media rewards attention. Algorithms reward engagement. The more emotional the reaction, the more visibility something receives. And that creates a dangerous reality. Sometimes outrage spreads faster than truth. Sometimes shock spreads faster than reason. Sometimes the very thing society condemns becomes the thing it amplifies. That is what makes Luka's story so disturbing. Because beneath the crime lies a darker psychological question. What happens when someone becomes willing to do absolutely anything to avoid being ignored? Not for money, not for survival, not for power, for attention, for visibility, for recognition. That possibility is terrifying. Because it suggests the crime may have been only part of the story. The deeper story may have been performance. The desperate need to be seen, to be remembered, to matter. And that leads us to the question that continues to haunt this case. Did Luka spend years trying to escape obscurity? Or was he moving toward exactly the ending he wanted? A global audience. Worldwide headlines, millions watching, a permanent place in public memory. If that was the goal, then the final truth becomes deeply disturbing. Because even in capture, he may have gotten exactly what he wanted: fame. And perhaps that is the most chilling part of all. Some monsters hide in darkness. Others learn to weaponize attention. This is the Crime Archive. Real cases, hidden truths, untold stories.